What happens when 1962 holds more secrets than it lets on? My grandson vanished at the county fair, but the truth turned out to be far more sinister. It forced me to wonder which one of us was truly lost. The year was 1962, and the air was thick with the scent of fried dough, popcorn, and sun-warmed dust. I was 58 years old, a woman who had seen a thing or two, but nothing could have prepared me for the day that would change our family forever. It was the annual county fair, and the whole town of Willow Creek was there. My grandson, little Billy, was all of 7 years old, a tornado of energy with a mischievous grin. I was watching him, a warm feeling in my chest, as he clutched a brand new silver locket I'd just bought for him from a vendor. For good luck, I'd said, fastening the small chain around his neck. Never take it off, not for a moment. He was mesmerized by the giant Ferris wheel, its colorful cars slowly rotating against the bright blue sky. "Grandma, can we go on it? Please, please?" he begged, his eyes wide with a combination of wonder and pure, unadulterated joy. A gentle, familiar ache settled in my heart. He was the son of my only child, Mark, and his wife, Carol. Mark, my sweet, sensitive boy, who had grown up to be a man I barely recognized, burdened with a resentment I couldn't understand. Carol, his wife, a woman who treated me more like a relic than a mother-in-law, always with a condescending smile. They had their own ideas about how Billy should be raised, ideas that didn't include old-fashioned things like locket gifts or rides on the dangerous Ferris wheel. I knew this, but I couldn't resist the look in Billy's eyes. It was a look that reminded me of my own son before the world and its rigid expectations had soured him. Just then, Mark and Carol sauntered over, looking as if they'd just stepped out of a magazine ad for Happy Family. "Mom, what are you doing?" Mark said, his voice a low, warning rumble. "You know he's not allowed on the rides. They're not safe." He shot a glance at the Ferris wheel as if it were a ticking bomb. Carol, with a perfectly manicured hand on Mark's arm, chimed in, "Oh, bless your heart, Martha. We appreciate you trying to give Billy a nice time, but we've told you 100 times. We prefer he stays away from those things." The condescension was thick. You could slice it with a knife. It was always "bless your heart" with her, a phrase that sounded sweet but was as sharp as attack. "It's just the Ferris wheel, Mark. He's been begging me," I said, a little defensive. I felt the familiar burn of injustice. All I was trying to do was give my grandson a memory, the same kind of memory I'd wanted to give my own son when he was a boy, before he started shutting me out. He just saw it as me undermining his authority, as me being a foolish old woman who didn't understand the world. "Besides," I added, "I have the tickets right here. We'll be fine." Mark's face hardened. He took a step toward me, and Carol's grip on his arm tightened. "We said no, Mom. Just leave it alone." He then turned to Billy and said, "Billy, go wait by the prize booth. Mommy and I will be there in a minute to get you a prize." Billy, sensing the tension, did as he was told. He gave me a sad little wave, his hand still on the silver locket I'd just bought for him from a vendor. A little boy, caught in the middle of a conflict he couldn't possibly understand. After he left, Mark and Carol started in on me. "We're trying to teach him to be responsible, Mom, not to just run off and do whatever he wants," Carol said, her smile not reaching her eyes. "We're trying to make it easier for us, and for him." My mind reeled. Responsible? He was a 7-year-old boy at a county fair. Was a ride on the Ferris wheel really going to make him a delinquent? It was all just a power play, a way to show me that I was an outsider, a relic, an inconvenience to be managed. "I'm his grandmother, Mark," I said, my voice shaking a little with indignation. "I'm just trying to make him happy." "Happy isn't safe," Mark shot back. "We'll be in charge of his happiness." The words felt like a slap. I could feel the tears welling up behind my eyes, but I swallowed them back. I wouldn't give them the satisfaction of seeing me cry. I was an old woman, but I wasn't broken. Not yet. I just stood there, watching them walk away, a perfectly presented, perfectly miserable family. Then I turned and started to walk toward the prize booth to find Billy.
I needed to see his face, to be with him, my bright, beautiful boy. I needed to let him know that someone, somewhere, had his back. That's when I saw the crowd around the prize booth, a silent, staring cluster of people. I heard the whispers before I heard the words. The gasps and mutters rippled through the crowd. "He's gone! They can't find him!" A cold dread crept up my spine. I pushed through the crowd, my heart hammering against my ribs. And there, standing in front of the empty prize booth, a panic look on his face, was Mark. Carol was beside him, her perfectly painted face streaked with tears. I looked around, my eyes scanning the faces, my mind screaming, "Where is he? Where is Billy?" My Billy, with his mischievous grin and the new silver locket I'd just bought for him from a vendor. Gone. Just like that. I couldn't believe it. I lost my grandson at the county fair in 1962, the very moment my family tried to cut me out of his life. All I wanted to give him was a simple joy, a ride on the Ferris wheel. And now, he was gone. But what came next was a revelation about my son and daughter-in-law that shook me to my core.
The frantic whispers turned into a siren's wail, a sound that sliced through the festive atmosphere like a butcher's knife through a roast. I stood there, frozen, watching the organized chaos unfold. The sheriff, a man named Henderson, with a face like a road map of bad decisions, arrived and started asking Mark and Carol questions. They were a mess of tears and stuttered sentences, completely unable to articulate what had happened. They were too wrapped up in their own drama, their own self-pity, to see the reality of the situation. This was my boy, my grandson. This was Billy, and I was going to find him. I wasn't going to stand around and watch them make a spectacle of our family tragedy. I was a woman of action. Always had been. I felt a surge of adrenaline, a cold, clear focus that only comes in a crisis. While they were busy being useless, I was going to be useful. I started walking, not running, but with a purpose. I retraced our steps, my eyes scanning the ground, the faces in the crowd, the places where a little boy might hide. I knew Billy. I knew he was afraid of loud noises, so he wouldn't be near the funhouse. I knew he was fascinated by animals, so he might be near the petting zoo. I knew he was a sweet boy, a kind boy, but also a clever one. He wouldn't just disappear. Not my Billy. As I walked, I heard snippets of conversations. "Poor Mark and Carol," someone said, "always so worried about that boy. And now?" Another person whispered, "That old woman, his grandmother, she was talking to him just before he disappeared." The whispers were like daggers. They were already painting me as the villain, the old woman who wasn't careful. They were already pointing fingers, making judgments, creating a narrative that suited their small-town sensibilities. But I didn't care. I just kept walking. I saw the silver flash first, a tiny glimmer in the grass near the Ferris wheel. My heart leapt into my throat. It was the locket I had just given him. I knelt down, my hands shaking as I picked it up. It was open, and the tiny picture of a smiling boy was gone. Just an empty space where a memory used to be. A sick feeling twisted in my gut. He had dropped it. He had dropped it after he was gone. What could have happened? What could have made him drop the one thing I told him to hold on to? I looked around. No one was watching me. They were all focused on Mark and Carol, the grieving parents. I put the locket in my pocket. This wasn't just a locket. This was a clue. This was a piece of my grandson that no one else had. This was a secret that only I would ever know. I felt a renewed sense of purpose. I was no longer just a worried grandmother. I was a detective. I was going to find out what happened to my Billy. I was going to find out the truth. I walked back to where Mark and Carol were talking to the sheriff. I found this, I said, holding up the locket. I didn't tell them where I'd found it. I just showed them what I'd found. Mark's eyes widened. The locket, he said, his voice a broken whisper. Carol looked at me with a mixture of fear and accusation. Where did you find it, Martha? She asked, her voice cold. That's not important, I said. What's important is that he's still out there. We have to find him. But they didn't see it that way. They saw me as a troublemaker, a woman who was trying to control the narrative, a woman who was trying to get in the way of their carefully constructed grief. Mark took the locket from me, his face pale. We need to give this to the police, he said, turning to the sheriff. The sheriff, in his infinite wisdom, took the locket and put it in a plastic bag. He didn't ask me any questions. He didn't ask me where I found it. He didn't care. He just looked at me as if I was a nuisance, a silly old woman who didn't understand how things worked. And that's when I knew I couldn't trust them. I couldn't trust the police. I couldn't trust anyone. I was on my own. I needed a moment to think, to breathe, to get my wits about me. I walked away from the scene, away from the flashing lights and the prying eyes, and found a quiet corner near the barn. I sat down on a hay bale. The smell of fresh hay and animal manure filling the air. I closed my eyes and took a deep breath. This was not a moment for panic. This was a moment for clarity. I had to think like Billy. I had to think like a 7-year-old boy. Where would he go? What would he do? And then it hit me. The silver locket. He had dropped it near the Ferris wheel. The Ferris wheel that Mark and Carol had forbidden him from riding. He had gone there. He had gone there to get on the ride. He was a smart boy. He knew how to get what he wanted. He knew how to get away from his parents. He had a secret. He had a secret that only I knew. I had to find him. I had to find him before they did. I had to find him and protect him from the world, from the lies, from the people who were supposed to love him but didn't. I had to find him and bring him home. I got up, brushed the hay from my skirt, and walked with renewed purpose. I was a grandmother on a mission, and no one, not my son, not my daughter-in-law, and not the entire town of Willow Creek, was going to stop me. What happened next was a nightmare, and the secret my son was keeping came crashing down on our entire family. But what he didn't realize was that I knew a secret of my own. The county fair had transformed from a place of joy and laughter into a grim, sprawling crime scene. Yellow tape cordoned off the Ferris wheel, and uniformed officers moved through the crowd, their faces grim. As I stood there, watching the scene unfold, I knew I couldn't rely on the police. They were too busy questioning the hysterical parents, too caught up in the optics of a public search. I had to find Billy myself. My mind raced, sifting through every detail I knew about my grandson. He was a curious boy, an adventurer in a world that his parents insisted was too dangerous for him. He loved quiet places, spaces where he could be a secret agent, a lone cowboy, a pirate in search of buried treasure. My first thought was the petting zoo. Billy loved animals, and the gentle goats and sheep were a stark contrast to the noise of the fair. But a quick glance revealed it was already being searched by volunteers. The barn, with its nooks and crannies, was another possibility, but I'd just left there. I needed to think outside the box. I needed to think like a boy who felt misunderstood, who was looking for an escape from the prying eyes of his parents,
from their endless rules and anxieties. I walked toward the edge of the fairgrounds where the last of the rides gave way to a line of old, beat-up cars. This was the backstage of the fair, where the carnies lived and worked. I knew Mark and Carol would never set foot here. They saw these people as lowlifes, as a bad influence, but I saw them as outsiders, just like Billy and me. I saw them as people who lived life on their own terms. I felt a pang of guilt, a fleeting thought of what my son and daughter-in-law would say if they saw me here. But that feeling was quickly replaced by a fierce determination. I wasn't just a mother or a grandmother anymore. I was a protector. As I walked, I heard a sound, not a scream or a cry, but a soft, rhythmic thump-thump. It was coming from one of the beat-up cars, a rusty old Ford with a broken window. I approached slowly, my heart pounding in my chest. "Billy," I whispered, my voice barely audible. The thumping stopped. I put my ear to the door and heard a soft sob. It was him. It was my boy. I tried the door, but it was locked. I peered through the broken window, and there he was, huddled in the back seat, his face streaked with tears and dirt. "Grandma," he said, his voice a shaky whisper, "I'm scared." My knees buckled with relief. I wanted to smash the window, to break down the door, but I knew I couldn't risk hurting him. I had to be smart. I had to be calm. Just then, a man emerged from a nearby tent, a burly carny with a handlebar mustache and a missing front tooth. He looked me up and down, a suspicious glare in his eyes. "You lost, lady?" "I'm looking for my grandson," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "He's in your car. He's been locked inside." The man's face went from suspicious to grim. He pulled a key from his pocket and opened the door. Billy tumbled out, and I wrapped my arms around him, holding him so tight I thought I might break him. He buried his face in my skirt, his little body trembling. "Grandma, I tried to get on the Ferris wheel, but the man said I needed a ticket, and I didn't have one. And then I hid in here. I didn't want to go back. I just wanted to ride the Ferris wheel." My heart ached for him. He wasn't lost. He was hiding from the very people who were supposed to protect him. Suddenly, Mark and Carol burst onto the scene, their faces a mixture of relief and fury. "Billy," Mark shouted, his voice a mixture of relief and anger, "what the hell were you thinking?" He grabbed Billy by the arm, yanking him away from me. "We've been looking for you everywhere." Carol followed, her eyes narrowing as she looked at me. "Martha, what were you doing back here? Did you put him up to this?" The accusation was so blatant, so cruel, it took my breath away. They didn't even stop to consider that I was the one who found him. They were too busy looking for someone to blame. But what came next was even shocking. The carny, who had been standing silently, watching the scene unfold, suddenly spoke up. He wasn't lost, he said. He was hiding, and when he got in here, he wasn't alone. My blood ran cold. I looked at Billy, at Mark, at Carol. "What do you mean?" Mark said, his face pale. "I found this in the car," the carny said, holding up a small, crumpled piece of paper. It was a letter from Billy to his father, a letter that explained everything, a letter that detailed the secret my son had been keeping, a secret that had driven Billy to run away, a secret that had been eating away at our family for years. The truth hung in the air like a thick fog, suffocating everyone. Mark stood there, his face a mask of shame and fury. Carol looked at the letter, her face a pale blank slate. They had been so consumed with their own desires, their own greed, that they hadn't seen the damage they were doing to their own son. They hadn't seen the pain they were causing. I looked at them, at their perfectly polished shoes and their perfectly pressed clothes, and I saw the ugliness beneath the surface. I saw the rot that had been festering for years. And in that moment, I knew what I had to do. I had to protect my grandson. I had to protect our family's legacy. I had to fight back.
This was the moment of truth. My son's secret was out. But what he didn't realize was that I had a secret of my own, a secret that would save our family's farm, a secret he never saw coming. The air was no longer filled with the smells of fair food. Instead, it was heavy with the stench of betrayal. Mark stood there, his face a horrifying mix of shame and rage, the crumpled letter clutched in his hand. Carol, ever the actress, had her hands over her mouth, her eyes wide with a practiced shock. But I saw the flicker of panic in them. It wasn't about Billy's safety anymore. It was about their plan, their perfect, selfish plan to sell my family's legacy. "This is a lie," Mark stammered, his voice weak. This is just a boy's imagination." "Imagination," I said, my voice as hard as the soil on our farm. "Is it imagination that you've been meeting with the developers from the city? Is it imagination that you've been telling everyone for months that the farm is too much work for a man your age?" I looked at Carol, her face a pale blank slate. "Is it imagination, Carol, that you've been drawing up plans for a shopping plaza on our land?" The silence that followed was deafening. The carney, who was a witness to all of this, simply shook his head and walked away, leaving us to our family drama. Billy, still clinging to me, looked up at his father, his eyes filled with a heartbreak no child should ever have to feel. "I heard you," he whispered. "I heard you tell Mom that Grandma wouldn't know until it was too late." Mark's face went white. He knew he was cornered, that his perfect deception had unraveled in a dusty parking lot. He took a step toward Billy and me, a desperate look in his eyes. "Billy, son, that's not what it sounded like." But the lie was hollow, a ghost of a sound that had no place in the real world. I held Billy closer. He was my boy now, my responsibility, my hope. "It's exactly what it sounded like, Mark," I said, my voice steady. "And you know it." I looked at him, at the man he had become, so different from the kind, sensitive boy I had raised. He had traded his soul for a shopping mall, his family's legacy for a new life of luxury. The worst of it wasn't the greed, but the sheer disrespect. The assumption that I, my own mother, was so old and so naive that I wouldn't see through his lies. He treated me like a relic, a piece of old furniture to be moved out of the way. Then, a sudden, horrifying thought crossed my mind. The locket, the one I gave him. Billy in his panic had dropped it, and what if it wasn't just him who ran away? What if there was something more? I thought about the carney's words. He wasn't alone. I looked at the old Ford, its broken window a gaping maw, and I felt a chill run down my spine. The truth was worse than I could have ever imagined. I knew I couldn't just stand there. My son had not only betrayed me, but had also put his own child in danger. The county fair was no longer safe. I needed to get Billy out of here, to a place where they couldn't find him, where they couldn't hurt him. I had to protect him from his own parents. I looked down at Billy, his face tear-streaked and exhausted. "We're going to my house, Sweet Pea," I said, my voice soft but firm. "Just you and me." But what about Dad and Mom?" he asked, his voice trembling. They're not coming with us," I said, my eyes fixed on my son. Mark's face contorted in a mix of fury and disbelief. "You can't do that, Mom. You can't just take him," he yelled. "I'm his mother," Carol screamed, her voice shrill. "I have rights." "Rights?" I said, a bitter laugh escaping my lips. "What rights, Carol? The right to lie? The right to betray? You both lost your rights when you put this family's future at risk." And with that, I took Billy's hand
and started to walk away. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. I could feel their eyes on my back, their silent rage, their impotent fury. They thought I was just an old woman with no power, but they didn't know the truth. They didn't know about the secret I'd been keeping for years, a secret that would turn their entire plan into a spectacular and public disaster.
The walk from the fairgrounds back to my house was a silent one, broken only by Billy's soft sniffling. I held a small hand in my own, a silent promise passing between us. My house, which had always felt like a sanctuary, now felt like a fortress. The porch light, a warm golden glow against the darkening sky, felt like a beacon of hope. I ushered Billy inside, the door clicking shut behind us with a satisfying finality. The familiar scent of lemon polish and old books filled the air, a comfort I desperately needed. I made him a cup of hot cocoa, a simple remedy for a soul bruised by betrayal. He sat on the old, worn armchair, a little boy in a world far too big for him. I looked out the window, watching the streetlights flicker on, one by one. I knew Mark and Carol would be home soon, their perfect little world in shambles. The thought gave me a grim satisfaction. They had underestimated me. They had seen an old woman, a relic from a bygone era, and they had mistaken my quiet strength for weakness. They didn't know the truth. They didn't know about the secret I'd been keeping for years. After Billy fell asleep, exhausted from the day's events, I went upstairs to the attic. The air was thick with the smell of mothballs and forgotten memories. I moved past old trunks and dusty furniture, my hand finding a loose floorboard in the far corner. I knelt down, my fingers prying it open. Inside, nestled in a velvet bag, was a simple, unassuming document. It was a deed for our family's farm, signed by my husband, Henry, a month before he passed away in 1955. But this wasn't just any deed. It was a life estate deed. I'd been keeping this secret for years. I knew Mark had always wanted the farm, had always assumed it would be his, but I also knew, deep down, that he didn't have the heart for it. He didn't have the love for the land that Henry and I had. So Henry, in his infinite wisdom, had drawn up this document. It stated that I would have the right to live on and control the farm for the rest of my life. And after I was gone, the farm would not go to Mark. It would go to our grandson, Billy. Henry had seen the truth long before I had. He had seen Mark's ambition, his greed, his complete lack of respect for the past. And he had protected our family's future in the only way he knew how. I clutched the document in my hand, a wave of emotion washing over me. This was my trump card. This was my weapon. This was the proof that their plans were for nothing. All their lies, all their manipulation, all their efforts to push me out of the picture, it was all in vain. I had the power to stop them. I had the power to save our farm, and I had the power to show my son and his wife what real family loyalty looked like. They had tried to take everything from me, but they had left the most important thing behind, my dignity. A sudden noise from downstairs made me jump. The front door slammed open, and I heard angry voices, Mark and Carol. They had found my car in the driveway. They were here. I took the deed back into its hiding place, my heart pounding in my chest. I had to be strong. I had to be calm. I walked down the stairs, my head held high. I was no longer an old woman. I was a force to be reckoned with, and they had no idea what was coming.
The front door burst open with a crash, and Mark and Carol stormed in. Their faces were red with a furious mix of panic and indignation. Mark's eyes immediately scanned the room, his gaze landing on Billy, who was still asleep on the armchair, wrapped in a blanket. "There he is!" Mark shouted, a mix of relief and accusation in his voice. "How dare you, Mom? You can't just take him." Carol marched over, her heels clicking on the hardwood floor like a metronome of her frustration. "We called the police, Martha. We told them you kidnapped him. You're going to jail." Her voice was shrill, cutting through the quiet of the house.
I simply stood there, watching their performance. This was their brand of drama, all theatrics and no substance. Jail? I said, a slow, sarcastic smile spreading across my face. For taking my grandson to my own home after his own parents drove him to run away? I'd say that's a new one, even for you two. Mark stepped forward, his fists clenched at his sides. He ran away because you filled his head with your old-fashioned nonsense. You're just jealous we're finally moving on with our lives and you can't stand it. I let him talk, letting his anger burn itself out. It was a pathetic sight. A man, so desperate for money and status, willing to throw away his family's history, his son's trust, and his own integrity. When he finished, I took a deep breath. You're right, Mark, I said, my voice quiet but firm. I am jealous. I'm jealous of the fact that you think you can just erase our past and buy a new future. I'm jealous of the fact that you've become a stranger to me. But mostly, I'm jealous of the fact that you're so blind, you don't even see what you've lost. The silence was thick. Billy stirred on the armchair, his little body trembling, but he didn't wake up. I looked at Mark and Carol, their faces a mixture of confusion and contempt. They had no idea what was coming. You want to talk about the future, Mark, I said, my eyes fixed on him. Let's talk about the future of this farm. I walked to the phone on the small table in the hallway, my hands steady. The police aren't going to do anything, Carol, but I'm sure the local newspaper will be very interested in this story. I could see their panic. They had a reputation to uphold, a public image to maintain. A scandalous story about them trying to sell the family farm behind my back would ruin everything. I put the phone to my ear, my voice loud and clear. Hello, this is Martha. Yes, Martha Thompson. I have a story for you. It's about a local family, a prominent one actually, and a little boy who ran away from a county fair because he found out his parents were trying to sell his grandfather's farm out from under him. Mark's face went pale to ashen. Mom, no, he pleaded, his voice a desperate whisper. Carol's jaw dropped. What are you doing? Think about the scandal. I ignored them. Yes, he's safe. He's with me, I said into the phone. And I have the documents to prove that the farm isn't for sale. Not now, not ever. I hung up the phone and looked at them. The balance of power had shifted. The tables had turned. They had underestimated me, and now they were going to pay the price. They had planned to take everything from me, but they had left the most important thing behind, my dignity. Mark stood there, defeated. His perfect plan, his perfect future was crumbling before his eyes. He had lost, and he had no one to blame but himself. This was just the beginning. The media descended on our small town, and the truth about my son's betrayal was broadcast for everyone to see. But the biggest shock was still to come, a revelation that would change our family forever. The next morning, the small town of Willow Creek was buzzing. The local newspaper, the Willow Creek Gazette, ran a front-page headline that screamed, "Prominent Family Caught in Land Scandal. Grandmother Reveals Shocking Truth." The story was a blow-by-blow account of what happened at the county fair. It detailed my son's deceit, my daughter-in-law's greed, and little Billy's brave attempt to stop them. Mark and Carol's carefully constructed image of a perfect family was shattered, their reputation in tatters. They were no longer the town's golden couple. They were the villains of a modern-day Greek tragedy. I watched it all unfold from my kitchen window, a cup of coffee in my hand. The phone rang off the hook with calls from neighbors, friends, and even people I hadn't spoken to in years. They all had the same thing to say. "We're so sorry, Martha. We had no idea." It was a vindication, but it was also a painful reminder of how easily people are deceived. I had spent years being a quiet, respectable woman, and in a matter of hours, I was a local celebrity. The following week, the media frenzy escalated. Television news crews from the city descended on Willow Creek. their big black vans parked haphazardly on the quiet streets. They wanted an interview with me, the woman who had brought her family's dirty laundry into the public eye. I refused them all. I wasn't looking for fame. I was looking for justice. Mark and Carol, however, were not so quiet. They gave a tearful interview to a local news channel trying to spin the story. They claimed I was mentally unstable, that I was a bitter old woman who was trying to sabotage their lives. "She's just not well," Carol said, her voice dripping with fake concern. "We love Martha, but she's not herself." Mark, standing beside her, nodded sadly. "We just wanted to do what was best for the family, and now our son is caught in the middle of this mess." Their performance was a masterpiece of manipulation, but I knew it wouldn't be enough. The truth was already out there. I had a story of betrayal and deceit, and the public was on my side. But I knew this was just the beginning. I had the deed in my possession, the proof that their plans were for nothing, and I was going to use it. The next day, I called a press conference. I invited every newspaper, every news station, and every reporter who had been hounding me. I told them I had a shocking revelation to make, a truth that would change everything. I didn't tell them what it was, but the mystery was enough to get them all there. I stood on the porch of my farmhouse, a document clutched in my hand. The cameras were rolling, the reporters were scribbling in their notebooks, and I knew that this was it. This was the moment of truth. I looked directly into the camera, my voice clear and steady. "I have a lot of respect for the press, for your work in uncovering the truth. I'm here today to provide you with the truth. My son Mark and my daughter-in-law Carol have been trying to sell this farm. They've been lying to me, lying to our friends, and lying to our community." I paused, letting my words sink in. "But they have failed. They have failed because they don't have the right to sell this land. The deed to this property, it's not in Mark's name." The reporter's murmurs grew louder. I unfolded the life estate deed and held it up for the cameras. "This farm," I said, my voice ringing with authority, "is mine for as long as I live. And when I'm gone, it will not go to my son. It will go to my grandson, Billy." My husband, Henry, saw what was coming. He knew Mark would try to do this. He protected our family's legacy. He protected our future. The murmurs turned into gasps, then into a chorus of shouted questions. "When was this signed, Mrs. Thompson? Does your son know? What does this mean for the land deal?" I didn't answer them. I just stood there, letting the silence speak for itself. The cameras flashed, the reporters scribbled in their notebooks, and I knew that the truth, the real truth, was finally out. I had won. I had publicly humiliated my son and daughter-in-law, but the real victory was still to come. I had the deed, I had the truth, and I had a plan to bring my family back together. But what I didn't expect was the devastating revelation about my grandson's secret that would force me to question everything I thought I knew.
The press conference was a firestorm. The reporters, sensing blood in the water, swarmed me with questions. "Mrs. Thompson, did your son know about this deed? Is this a legal document? What do you say to those who claim you're mentally unstable?" I held my ground, my posture as straight as an oak tree. "My son knew exactly what he was doing," I said, my voice cutting through the noise. "He was counting on me being too old and too weak to fight back. He was wrong. As for my sanity, I'll let the document speak for itself." I handed a copy of the deed to a reporter, and within minutes the news was spreading like wildfire. My phone, which had been ringing off the hook with hate mail, now exploded with messages of support. I was a hero. My triumph was short-lived. That evening, as I was tucking Billy into bed, he looked at me with his big brown eyes. "Grandma," he said, "I have to tell you something." My heart sank. I knew that look. It was the look of a child who was holding on to a secret far too heavy for his small shoulders. "What is it, Sweet Pea?" I asked, my voice as gentle as I could make it. I wasn't alone in the car," he whispered, his voice trembling. "The carney, he found me first. He said he had a secret for me."
My blood ran cold. A secret? I asked, my mind racing. What kind of secret, honey? Billy's eyes filled with tears. He said, he said my dad wasn't my real dad. He said my real dad was a man named George. My world stopped. I felt the floor crumble beneath my feet. George. A name I hadn't heard in over 30 years. A name that I had tried to forget. George was my husband's brother, a charming, wild man who had left town decades ago. I had a brief, passionate affair with him before I met Henry. It was a secret I had buried deep within my heart, a secret that I had never told a soul, a secret that would now unravel our entire family. Billy continued, his voice barely a whisper. He said he knew because he was friends with George. He said George told him to keep an eye on me. I sat there stunned. The carney, he wasn't just a witness to our family drama, he was a part of it. He was a friend of George, a ghost from my past, a man who had been watching my son's son for years. The truth was a tidal wave, crashing down on me, drowning me in a sea of guilt and regret. My mind reeled, the deed, the press conference, the public humiliation. It was all for nothing. I had fought for a legacy that wasn't even ours. I had fought for a boy who wasn't my grandson by blood. I had exposed my son's deceit, but in doing so I had now stumbled upon a far more devastating secret, a secret that would not only ruin my family, but also expose me for the liar I had been all these years. This was the moment of reckoning. The secret that I had kept for decades was now out. But what I didn't realize was that the carney, George's friend, had a final shocking revelation that would turn my world upside down and force me to confront the past I had so desperately tried to bury. The shock of Billy's words hung in the air like a thick, suffocating fog. My mind raced, trying to connect the pieces of a puzzle I never knew existed. The carney, the secret, the truth I had buried for decades. I felt a profound sense of shame, a deep, burning regret. All this time, I had fought for a legacy that wasn't mine to defend, for a bloodline that was a lie. I had publicly humiliated my son only to discover that the moral high ground I had so proudly claimed was nothing more than a swamp of my own deceit. The next morning, with the sun rising and casting a cold, hard light on my hypocrisy, I knew what I had to do. I couldn't lie anymore. Not to Billy, not to Mark, and not to myself. I had to face the man who held the key to my past, the man who had been watching from the shadows all these years. I took Billy's hand and drove back to the county fairgrounds, which were now a ghost town. The rides were still, the tents were empty, and the air was still thick with the lingering scent of popcorn and cotton candy. We found him in the same spot, next to the beat-up Ford. He was packing up his tent, his movements slow and deliberate. He looked up as we approached. His eyes, the same piercing blue as George's, were kind but knowing. "I knew you'd come," he said, his voice a gentle rumble. "He told me you would." "Who are you?" I asked, my voice trembling. "My name is Gus. George and I were friends. He told me everything. He told me about you, about your son, about the secret you kept all these years." He paused, his gaze shifting to Billy. "He told me about him too. He was his greatest hope." A wave of emotion washed over me. He's alive?" I asked, a mix of hope and dread in my voice. "He was," Gus said, his voice quiet. "He passed away last year. He asked me to come here, to find you. He told me to watch over Billy, to make sure he was happy. And he gave me something for you, in case you ever needed it." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small leather-bound book. He said you'd know what to do with it. I took the book, my hand shaking. It was George's diary, filled with his thoughts, his regrets, and his love for me. He had written about our affair, about his longing for a life he couldn't have. He had written about the son he never knew and the hopes he had for him. He had written about how he had always known Mark wasn't his son, but that he had loved him anyway. He had kept the secret to protect me, to protect our family. He had given Mark the deed to the farm, but he had made sure to add a clause that gave me a life estate, a safety net in case Mark ever betrayed us. He hadn't seen Mark's ambition as a threat. He had seen it as a test of my love, a test of our family's strength. And then I understood. The deed wasn't a punishment, it was a test to see if Mark would rise to the occasion and prove himself worthy. And he had failed. He had failed to love the land, he had failed to love his family, and he had failed to love his own son. He had seen the farm as a business, not a home. He had seen me as a burden, not a blessing. He had seen our family as a commodity, not a sanctuary. I looked at Billy, then at Gus, then at the empty fairgrounds. I had fought so long, so hard for a truth that I thought was my own. But the truth was so much bigger than that. The truth was about love and forgiveness and the power of family, even when it's not bound by blood. The truth was that I had been wrong about everything. I had been so caught up in my own pride and anger that I had failed to see the most important thing. I had failed to see that our family, broken as it was a legacy worth fighting for. I took Billy's hand and led him away from the fairgrounds, a sense of peace settling in my heart. I didn't need to lie anymore. I didn't need to fight. I just needed to love. And in that moment, as I looked at my grandson, I knew that was the most important lesson of all. The secret was out, and the future, for the first time in a long time, was finally clear. As I walked away from the fairgrounds with Billy, a sense of peace settled in my heart. The weight of my secret, the guilt I had carried for decades, was finally gone. I had been so focused on fighting a battle of my own making, I had almost lost sight of the real victory, the truth. I drove us back home, and as we pulled into the driveway, I saw a car parked on the street. It was Mark's. He and Carol were sitting on the porch, their faces pale and defeated. They had seen the news about the deed, about Henry's will, about their public humiliation. They looked like ghosts, their perfect world shattered into a million pieces. I ushered Billy into the house, but as I was about to close the door, Mark's voice stopped me. "Mom," he said, his voice a shaky whisper, I'm so sorry." I looked at him, at the man who had tried to betray me, and I saw a glimmer of the boy I once knew. The boy who loved the farm. The boy who used to run through the fields with his dog. The boy who had once promised me he would never leave me. "I know," I said, my voice soft. "I know you are." Carol stood up, her face a mask of shame. "Martha, we never meant, we just—" Her voice trailed off. I knew what she was trying to say. They had just gotten lost in their own ambition, their own greed, and they had forgotten what was truly important. "I know," I said again, "but it's too late for that. We all have to live with the choices we've made." And then I did something I never thought I would do. I opened the door. "Come inside," I said. "We have a lot to talk about." They looked at me stunned. They had expected me to slam the door in their faces, to revel in my victory, to punish them for their betrayal. But I wasn't going to do that. I was a mother, and they were my family, broken as it was. I had a story to tell them, a story about a secret that would change everything, a story that would either bring us closer together or tear us apart forever. I had to take that chance. We sat in the living room, the same room where Billy had fallen asleep on the armchair, the same room where I had made my phone call to the newspaper, the same room where I had won my public victory. But now it was a place of truth, a place of reckoning. I looked at Mark and Carol, at their tear-streaked faces, and I began to speak. I told them about George, about my secret, about Henry's last wish, and about the carney who had brought us all back together. I told them about the deed, about Henry's last test, about how he knew all along. I told them everything. When I finished, the room was silent. Mark stood up and walked to the window, his back to me. "All these years," he said, his voice a choked whisper. "All these years I thought I was a bastard, that I had no right to this land, that I was a fraud." He turned around, his eyes red. "I've been trying to prove myself my whole life, to you, to Dad, to everyone, and I never even had to." I stood up and walked to him, wrapping my arms around him. "You are not a fraud, Mark. I am your son, and Henry loved you more than anything. He saw something in you, something he saw in himself. He saw a man who would fight for what he believed in, even if it was for the wrong reasons." And then a little hand took mine. It was Billy. "Dad," he said, his voice soft, "it's okay. We can fix this. We can fix everything." Mark looked down at his son, at the boy who had run away from him, and he broke down. He hugged Billy, his body shaking with sobs. It was a moment of grace, a moment of forgiveness, a moment of a family finally healing. I had won. I had saved the farm, I had protected my grandson, and I had brought my family back together. I had not only won the battle, I had won the war. I had faced my past, I had embraced my present, and I was ready for my future. And in that moment, as I stood there, surrounded by the people I loved, I knew that the greatest victory of all was not in winning, but in loving.